This Erasing Shame podcast episode comes with a trigger warning about many things. We talk about difficult life topics like suicidal ideation, depression, domestic violence, child abuse, family trauma, complex trauma, church hurt, spiritual abuse, and other things too. We speak to them because that is a part of erasing shame and finding healing. You're listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. I'm DJ Chuang, and I'm joined with my new good friend, Sonia Lee from Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm here in Orange County, California. Sonia is a wellness coach, therapist, all kinds of things. Story
Not
coach.
a therapist, but story coach. Yeah.
Story coach. See, this is raw and authentic, unedited, so it's okay to be corrected and adjusted because each of those words mean different things, especially in different states. So we'll stick with the word coach. And she has been well trained over a decade of experiences, and she brings in her own lived experience, and you'll get to hear that in the hour we have together. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, DJ, for having me. Hello, everybody.
Well, we start with a simple question, though it's not simple. What comes to mind when you hear the word shame? And I suppose I should expand that and say, what comes to mind and body when you hear the word shame?
Yeah. I think for me, there's first is, isolation, the sense of isolation, complete isolation, darkness, cold, like the feeling of freezing cold on the inside. And at the same time, it's like burning pain in my stomach. Like an urge to hide my face, to hide my story, to hide anything related to me and who I am. Yeah. And as a story coach, what I do is I help people turn back to some of the stories of shame. Because what we want to do is run from those stories of shame. And I did that for so many years. And until my life just crumbled and I realized I needed to go back to some of those stories that have been so shameful for me. And I needed to engage those stories and do the work that my body needed to do to be able to face those stories again, the ones that I worked so hard to run from. And I have a story that I want to share because I feel like it's such a good depiction of shame.
Yes.
What's happening in the story? I'm 8 years old, and I'll just start reading the story.
Yes. Go ahead.
It says, it was a sunny day out. The sun was bright. The birds were chirping. The weather was pleasant in Texas that winter day. There were moms and dads out with their children, people eating, laughing, chatting, everyone going about their lives. I looked at them as someone would peek in through a window into a closed building. I wondered what their lives were like. They seemed to be happy and carefree. I longed to feel those feelings. I sat at a table of a restaurant by a park. My mother sat across from me. It was my birthday. I was turning 8. My mother was reading her favorite type of literature. Desire was on the cover, with a man and a woman kissing passionately. They looked like they couldn't live without the other, and that was puzzling and nauseating to me.
Mm.
My mother read these books anytime she could get away from the house, away from my dad's hunger for control, and away from his wrath and fury. I had heard my dad argue with my mom about these types of literature. He would say these books were just like his porn magazines, and he had forbidden her to ever read them. But she always made time for these favorite books of hers. Today, I was with her, and any time I could be far from my dad was a good thing. It was my birthday, and I felt anxious and empty. There was no food on our table, and it wouldn't be coming. There would be no presents, no birthday parties. Those were things I heard about at school from other kids who were normal. I knew my mom had no money today. We were simply occupying an unattended table on the outside seating area. I turned my gaze from the world passing by to my mother. She wore a simple blouse and skirt. My dad did not allow her to wear pants. He said that she looked like a whore with them on.
Mm.
So she wore nude pantyhose instead to cover the bruises, which often made their appearance on her legs. Today, she also had bruises on her face and arms. She had just gone through a series of beatings by my dad just days prior. The brutality that she lived with had taken away vision from her left eye, and some of her teeth were missing. Although she never talked about it, I knew she was in pain. And this moment was a short respite before it all started again. I gazed at her in utter confusion. I felt hollow, as though a gaping hole had managed to make its home inside of me. I lived perplexed, my mind in complete disarray. I couldn't make order of the chaos I lived in. I needed to understand, but there was no one to explain. The angst and pain I felt was suffocating. "Mom," I said quietly, tiptoeing my way around the outskirts of the current story she was reading, knowing she meant to get lost in it. "Why don't you leave my dad? Please. He's not good for you, Mom. He hurts you. You can leave him, Mom. We can leave." I desperately wanted her eyes to meet mine, but she made no eye contact. My mother responded undisturbed, without looking away from her book. She said, "What happens between your dad and I is not your business. It has nothing to do with you." She kept reading her book as I sat in utter darkness. I turned my gaze back to watch the world pass me by, and I felt myself falling into a deep, dark void, disappearing into nothingness.
That's
That
heavy.
story, yeah, it's a heavy story, and it's one of my lighter stories. Um, yeah, it took me years to face these types of stories in my life. But the shame aspect of the story is, well, there's a lot of aspects to the story um, that were so shameful for me. But at the end of the story, this little girl is falling into this deep, dark void. She's looking for eye contact from her mother, and there isn't any. And that deep, dark void was shame for me. It's like it was swallowing me up. And in that void is where the cold is, where the loneliness, the isolation, the almost like being buried while I'm alive. Nobody knows where I am. Nobody knows me. Nobody knows this is happening. Because if someone looks at my mom and I sitting at a table, they think we're waiting for food and we're just having a good day together. But that's not what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for having the courage to share that with our audience.
Thank you, DJ.
Now, coming out of that shame probably took a long time and a lot of effort.
Yes, absolutely.
How did you find the first step to erase that shame, to get out of it?
Yeah. I don't think it's like I've erased it completely. Sharing the stories of my life is part of my constant battle, I think, for shame not to continue to hide me in my story and continue to, like, I don't want to own this shame because it's not mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that for me is I continually battle the shame through these kinds of opportunities to share my story, to uh, guide people through their own stories of pain. Because something about harm makes us, it's like it wants us to be lost in the shame and to be swallowed up by it. So I don't think it's a like, okay, I've conquered shame and it's over. I think it does get easier. I feel it getting easier the more opportunities that I find to use my story to bring good, some good. The first step for me was my life just crumbled. It wasn't like I chose to necessarily to go back into these types of stories and engage them. It was that the life that I had built crumbled.
Well, here's the thing. There's some people that will never go back there and somehow survive.
Yeah.
But it's eating them up on the inside. It's coming out sideways. But something in your life gave you an opportunity where you found the courage or someone intervened that helped you take a step out of it. And it's apt that we call this erasing shame, not erased shame in our podcast, because it is in some ways, a lifelong journey because we live with scars.
Right.
We live with those memories, but as we're erasing shame, it no longer holds that kind of debilitating power over us.
Right.
But we find power to heal and we find power to move.
Yes. Exactly. My life crumbling was the first thing that happened in my life that helped me realize I have to go back to, there's something that's core to what's happening right now in my life as an adult, but there's something that happened in my childhood that I have not engaged. And so going back toward those stories of pain and trauma was the first, I guess, the second thing that I did. The first thing, it wasn't anything I chose, but from that point of my life has crumbled and I don't know where I am anymore. I've lost direction. I've lost myself and I have lost people whom I deeply loved.
Mm.
And in that place was the only path was, let's go back to some of these stories,
Mm.
the ones you've been running from, the ones that are very, very painful, excruciating.
So for you, the
And that's
crumbling
how
was the loss of someone.
the crumbling was a series of things that happened in my life.
Mm.
It was all of it happening at the same time.
Mm.
It was the loss of a community, a spiritual community that I had been a part of for 12 years.
Mm.
Um, the loss of myself in this religious community that I used to be a part of.
Mm.
Emotional abuse that was happening in my relationship at that time.
Mm.
The trauma, the trauma that I was experiencing through the stories of others. And how that started to also make its way to touch my own childhood trauma. So
Oh,
all of those things were simultaneously happening in my life a
yes.
few years ago. And that's what made, I feel like it needed to be that intense and that many things to break through to me, to make me break all the way.
Wow.
Because I endure very well. I endure pain very well. So I feel like it had to be that many things all at the same time to be able to get me to break and for my life to completely crumble.
And before that crumbling time, you just mentioned that you had been part of a faith community for 12 plus years. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
guessing faith has been part of your life even longer than that. You've gone through
Yeah.
college, you have family. How does bringing memories and experiences from the past into a story make a difference in healing compared to just talking about moments in life?
Yeah. So what happens sometimes in very traumatic situations is that, for example, in my own story, there was severe childhood abuse that I was experiencing as a child.
Mm.
My dad was an addict, and he was brutal. He abused me, but that was the smaller thing of all the other things that were happening. He would regularly beat my mother,
Mm.
and I'm talking about brutal beatings in front of me. And sometimes
Mm.
I was forced to watch. So my dad was not only brutal, but he was also very sadistic. So there was a lot of mind um, manipulation, control, and he knew how to cause mental pain, emotional pain, and physical pain. He would burn my mother
Mm.
with cigarettes,
Mm.
um, humiliate her, find ways to humiliate her in front of me, and would make me watch. My dad also beat my mother when she was pregnant.
Oh, goodness.
And he would, when she was pregnant, the times when she was pregnant, he would focus in all the strength of his wrath on her belly. So he was purposefully trying to cause harm to the child. And so I remember
Goodness.
being about 5 years old, and he would beat her. And I just remember being so confused about what happened to the baby because the baby was never born. And this happened,
Mm.
3 or 4 times. that I can remember. But what happened was that, so that was the murders of these unborn babies in my presence were the thing that really, it was like a cancer living inside of me. But what my body did to survive was it just suppressed it. It kind of put it away. Like, we're not going to think about that ever because we don't know what to do with that. So I grew up, and I also spent some time in orphanages and things like that. And there was sexual abuse from a teacher when I was growing up. So there was so much trauma happening in my life that my body was just like, we're just not going to think about this. We're going to put this away just so we can survive, because that's what the body does. It has to find a way to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times we survive through suppressing deeply, like burying these memories somewhere far away.
Yes.
So we can keep living. So I grew up and got out of that situation, went to college, studied, um, went to seminary, studied trauma. I was on some level, like, I could remember I had spent time in orphanages. I could remember those things, but it was not, I had never engaged the depth of actually you witnessed murder until I started to get deep in my trauma work, helping, walking with other people and their traumas. And sometimes what they would say would remind me of things about my own trauma that I had never engaged. So at that time, I was working as a trauma care pastor. So I was hearing all the trauma stories and loved my work. I still love my work because I still do trauma work, but not in a church setting. Loved the people so deeply, but their stories were really starting to get to me. So at the same time, all the other things were happening. There was a lot of spiritual abuse that was happening too, and in my relationship at that time as well, there was emotional abuse happening. So going back to the stories of murder that I witnessed has made all the difference for me, because yes, there was spiritual abuse happening. Yes, there was emotional abuse happening in my, at that time, relationship. And those things are important too. However, going back to the very root of how I was set up to even be vulnerable, to stay in a place where there was spiritual abuse for that many years, is important, because if I only address the spiritual abuse, the emotional abuse that was happening in my relationship, then I'm staying at not a surface level, but maybe at a mid level. And I might just go back into another relationship where there will be emotional abuse. I might just go back into another religious institution where there's going to be religious abuse. If I don't go back to the actual core, the actual root of how I was even vulnerable in the first place. And that has made a difference for me. I don't want to just address what happened to me last week or a month or a year ago. I want to address what happened to me as a child, because that's going to uncover for me what I have needed and where I have sought to find it. And why did I give all of me to a person or a religious institution and left myself with nothing? I have to address that, which is what happened. To address that, I have to go back all the way to childhood.
Wow. So it's origin stories in the dark sense of it.
Yeah.
I think as we prepared for this conversation, this is in that category of complex trauma, complex grief.
Absolutely.
And you recently had to do some physical body work in addition to story work.
Yes.
Can you describe a bit of what that was like for you?
Yes.
To continue this
Body
healing
work.
process because you were crumbled?
Yeah. Body work has been so important. As I have attempted to, when I first started to try to go back to these origin stories, I found that it was almost impossible for me. I would just, I would cry a lot, like uncontrollably. My body would start to shake. I would feel extremely cold. My extremities would get very cold. I would get burning pains in my stomach. I would feel like I can't breathe. These are all trauma responses of the body. So, for example, the story I read today, it took me at least 2 years of hard work in my body to be able to help my body, support my body enough to where I was willing, my body and my heart and my mind all together, we could enter into that scene of my life without being overwhelmed and possibly cause re-traumatization to myself. So learning how to breathe deeply has been something that has helped me tremendously. It's something so simple. It sounds like so simple, but it's actually not simple when you try to do it, especially if there's been a lot of trauma. That can be really difficult to actually begin to do. So I've been practicing that for several years. Deep breathing, but also yoga has been extremely helpful, just moving my body. Running is another thing that has helped me tremendously in helping my blood circulation, because in survival mode, which is how our bodies go to survival mode when we are in trauma, our breathing gets shallow. We don't breathe deeply. And also part of our system's survival response is we don't move, so we get frozen. And that's one of the survival mechanisms, is we might freeze. And so our blood does not circulate as it needs to circulate. We don't get enough oxygen to our brain. There's a lot of things that are happening in our bodies as we're trying to survive. So moving on purpose has been so helpful. And all of these things I've been practicing for several years. I had to, because I couldn't go back into these origin stories without these body tools.
Yes.
So recently I went to, I travel. I've been doing a lot of traveling to connect with my ancestral roots. And so I've been traveling overseas, and I've been to China, and my great grandfather immigrated from China, Guangzhou, China. And I'm also, so I have Spanish and Chinese ancestry. And part of what I did recently I went to Central America, and I went to the area where my dad had been born. And my dad's deceased now. He died when I was a teenager from his addiction. And I had never had any closure with my dad, because when he got sick, I did not go see him at the hospital. And when he died, I did not attend his funeral. And later I heard, and this happened when I was a teenager, but later I heard that my dad had asked for me by name to ask for forgiveness, and I was not there. So many years later, as I've gone back to some of these stories, I realized that, I've been carrying this complex grief for a man who killed so much in my life and who was my biological dad and never had closure. And I never allowed my heart to grieve him because that was another way that was the only way I could survive. It's like, we're not going to love this man. We're not going to grieve him. We're not going to mourn him. And as I've been going back to these stories of my childhood, I've discovered that there is a little girl in me who loved her dad, who longed for her dad, who yearned to be held by him. And who wanted to be at his bedside when he was dying. Who wanted to weep for him. And I never allowed her to because it was not safe. And because those stories were so far from me and I honestly couldn't get to them. My life had to crumble so that I could get to these stories, so that I could be able to touch again the pain that this little girl went through with me, so that I could remember the blood and the suffering, the murders, the little siblings that I never met, and how painful that was for me. I had to go back to these stories, almost like it was a journey on the inside of me, so that I could remember, oh yeah, there was this little girl who did love her dad. And she needs closure. So part of what I did was I traveled to Central America, and it was like a visceral journey because honestly, DJ, I didn't really made sense of it in my head. Like, I'm going this and I'm going to do it. Like, I didn't really have like this plan of 1, 2, 3. It was more of I need to go to the land where my dad was born because he's not here anymore. And that's the only way that maybe I can find something that I can touch with my hands. Maybe I can feel the earth of that land. Maybe this will help me somehow find closure. So I climbed this volcano, 13,000 feet above sea level. It was excruciating physically and emotionally. It was a 2-day hike. I was extremely cold, which a lot of the trauma symptoms were coming to me as I was doing this climb. It was extremely, extremely cold. There were moments in the climb where I was sobbing, and I would hear inside of me some flashbacks from my childhood and things about my dad. But I prayed. I said, God, I don't know what this is about, but if you can make this happen, like, I'm ready to hear what my dad had to say at his deathbed. And it was a prayer. Like, that entire climb, it was like this prayer, this plea, this mourning, this wailing, this I'm letting this little girl inside of me, it felt like I'm letting her go meet with her dad. That's how it felt on the inside of me as I was climbing. And during the climb, I did have this experience where inside of me, not audible voice, but inside of me, I started hearing my dad. And he was not making excuses about what he did. He was not angry. It was like a different, like the dad that I always wanted. It was the voice of my dad in a loving way, talking to me like I was this little girl and saying, I'm so sorry. I did these things. You are not crazy. I murdered these little babies in front of you, and I murdered so much more inside of you. And I'm so sorry. And now that I'm not here anymore, I understand what I did. I understand. I feel the weight of it with you. It was like he was really like feeling this with me. And there was so much grief in how I was hearing his voice inside of me. And that at the end of this climb, I look back on it now and I'm like, I don't know how that happened, but that was closure for me. That was the closure that I needed with my dad. Just for him to say, I don't know, like saying I'm sorry sounds like so little. Like I feel like I need more words, but I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry. It was the words I never heard from my dad. But as I prayed and asked God, I want to hear what my dad had to say on his deathbed. I feel like that was it. That's what he wanted to say to me. Yeah. And
it sounds
recovering from
like,
that climb.
yeah, it sounds like it was through that excruciating exertion of effort that you were able to bring your
Yes.
mind, body, and spirit to be in a place to receive the weight of that grief and remorse in
Yes.
the
That's
loss.
so good. Yes, absolutely. The climb had to be excruciating for my body. Like I understand why people do extreme sports now. Like I get it because there is an emotional release that happens when we challenge our bodies in a good, healthy way. Like not to where we're hurting them, but like in a way that's beyond what I thought I could do.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point where my body is in pain and I'm still climbing. I'm still hiking this. I mean, it's steep. Hiking a volcano is steep. It's a steep uphill climb. And every muscle in my body, every part of my body, I'm hurting. And doing that for 2 days is very strenuous, to say the least. But that kind of body work um, helped my body to release the grief that my heart and body had been holding for so many years because it was so buried deep within me. Yeah.
Can we take a step back and review a little bit of the logistics and the practical part? Like, did you hike alone or did you have a Sherpa or someone to make sure you were safe?
Yes, absolutely. Don't try to do that on your own. I think
Okay.
I did. I went with a group, so it was we were all doing this together. But I did have it was a large group, so we have a lot of time on our own. We're not always together. So definitely make sure you're safe. I am planning on doing it again. Um, because I do see the benefit of. I think for my kind of grief, the complex grief that's been buried for so long, because of the extreme trauma that I experienced as a child, those kinds of extreme, hikes are very helpful for me. I don't recommend it if, as soon as someone starts to feel like this is maybe not good, like, check with your doctor and all of that. So, but I'm saying like for my kind of story where I held it for so long and buried it so deep, that kind of extreme exercise can actually be helpful to help me release the emotional, deep grief that I've had in my heart for so many years and body.
Yeah, and as you're doing the body work, you also probably have a coach that is walking you through these things.
Absolutely. Like,
So
I
again,
mean,
this is not something
yeah,
anyone can do alone.
right. No. Oh my gosh. No. And I would say, please don't do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've had, I mean, I started doing yoga maybe about, 6 or 7 years ago, and it was
Mm-hmm.
through yoga classes. I was taking
Mm-hmm.
classes. So I've always had someone teaching me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, uh, Swimming, I usually do it alone. That's kind of a sport that I do alone because I go really early in the morning and swim, maybe like 5, 6 in the morning, and the pool is quiet. And I like that because it helps me enter into the heart aspect of why I'm doing body work. Um, but when it comes to hiking or extreme excursions, things like that, yoga, anything that where there's possibility to get injured, definitely need we need a coach. We need someone to help us with that. And I know that all of that has prepared me to be able to have gone last month and hike a volcano. I don't know. I don't think I could have done that
Mm-hmm.
without already knowing how to do some deep breathing,
Mm-hmm.
without already knowing how to stretch my body, how to do yoga, being active every day, uh, five times, 5 times a week at least, moving my body, running, swimming. Um, so there has been a lot of preparation and training, even though I didn't necessarily know that I was training for to hike a
Mm-hmm.
volcano, and to help me release deep seated grief. But all of those things have prepared me to do what I did.
Mm. Well, we've covered a lot in a short time.
Mm-hmm.
Snapshots of your very painful story from childhood and crumbling and the hard work about it, body work.
Mm-hmm.
And you also do quite a bit for yourself and for others in terms of wellness coaching and story
Mm-hmm.
work to bring all that
Mm-hmm.
healing together because it's multifaceted and
Yes.
many dimensions. So describe how
Mm-hmm.
the healing process comes together,
Mm-hmm.
um, how you bring all the pieces together,
Mm-hmm.
how that connects to our identity, and how did
Yeah.
you take the crumbles back up and become resilient and whole again, or
Mm-hmm.
in process of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In my own journey, there's been some picking up of more of the pieces of me, not pieces of wanting to go back to the world that I used to have because it's not there anymore. But it was more of like, oh yeah, I remember this story of this little girl, you know. I remember I remember what happened to my siblings. And I remember this suicidal teenager I used to
Mm,
be, and these nightmares of blood. Like I would literally have just nightmares where I'm dreaming of blood and feeling like there's something wrong with me. There's What is this? What does this mean? And why do I always feel like I don't belong in this world?
mm,
And and it was all the time. I had to go back to these stories to now I understand like that was just tremendous survivor guilt. As a little girl,
mm,
I had survived these beatings when I was in my own mother's womb,
mm. Wow.
right? I survived that, but they didn't. Why me? Why me? And so the symptoms was the blood, the nightmares of blood, the constant feeling of I don't belong here. I need to go. I need to go. I need to leave this earth because I don't belong here. Um, Depression. I spent so much of my teenager and young adult life depressed. The only way out seemed to be I just need to end my life. That was the only thing that would always come. Like it was like an automatic, like this is the way that you do it. This is the way that you end the pain.
Mm,
And so for me, all of these are symptoms. Now I know these were
mm,
symptoms of, yes, you witnessed your dad killing your siblings
mm,
and you have survivor guilt. And we need to go back to that place of those stories. And we need to remember what happened because
mm,
you need to mourn these babies
mhm,
because it wasn't just mourning my dad, it was mourning these little babies
mhm,
that I never got to meet. It was mourning my mother, what happened to her,
mhm,
mourning what happened to me, that little girl that was there in that scene. And so those are the pieces that I've picked up. It was the pieces of the characters in that story and in
mhm,
all of the stories of my life and my childhood. Um, to be able to do that, I needed to get the body tools
mhm,
because when I tried to enter those stories, I couldn't.
mhm,
So learned how to breathe. And so putting, body work, moving my body, getting my circulation going, helping my body to get out of the frozen survival mode.
mhm,
Um, Finding a community who can love me, not based on whether I love Jesus or not, but based on I'm a human.
mhm,
I'm a human made in the image of God. Um, I didn't want another community that they will love me if, you know?
mhm,
And so that's a very important part, like finding people, creating, cultivating relationships that are real relationships. Um, it's not just about going back to the story, but learning. So going back to the story, yes, learning body tools that can help aid you in facing some of these things that we run from so hard because some of them are terrifying. They're scary.
mhm,
And then creating, stepping out into courage in finding friends, cultivating friendships and community. Um, and then exploring your little part of the world to see like what's beautiful here. That's another part that's super important in trauma work and in caring for yourself if you've been through trauma is you got to find beauty. There is beauty. And right now maybe, it looks dark and maybe the sky is gray and the sun has disappeared. Maybe, you're cold, but I promise you there's beauty in the world. It's
mhm,
not just it's not just pain and it's not just
mhm,
betrayal. There is love and there is beauty and there is warmth that we can find again. And so I feel like all of these pieces, putting them together into this, um, it's like a broken puzzle, that
yeah,
we just kind of have to put effort and intention into knowing like the pieces are here. I just need to find them,
mhm, mhm,
and looking into every corner. I mean, that's how I see it, in my own story. It's like a broken puzzle and it just kind of the pieces kind of fell everywhere
mhm,
in my room. And I know that maybe they went under the bed, maybe they're under the chair, maybe they're, you know, under the blanket or under the pillow somewhere, but they're in here somewhere and I have to find them. And that's how I've been able to get myself moving into these other directions where I don't know, like some of these places, I was like, I don't know what's going to happen when I get here. I don't know if I'm going to find more trauma. I don't know if there's going to be someone who's going to hurt me, but I also know that there is beauty somewhere. There is love somewhere. And that's another important part is love from within. Because a lot of times when we've been through awful experiences, we naturally believe that if we can find that person who will love us, then we can be happy. But what I have found is that there is a deeper love. There's a deeper love because I do believe that we were created in the image of God. And I do believe we were fashioned lovingly by this being who is a higher power and a greater being than us. And I believe that in the making of us, this higher being put love inside of us. This love that is divine, that is in each of us. And a lot of times as people who have gone through trauma, we don't know how to access that love on the inside of us. There's so many blocks because we're running from our story, because we don't know who we are. We don't know what we value. We don't know what means so much to us. We don't even know what shattered us in the first place. And so going back to these stories has shown me that I have loved deeply. That's why my heart was broken. I loved my mother. I became her protector when I was 4 or 5 years old. I also actually did love my dad, which I thought I hated him. But as I went back to these stories, I realized, no, I actually loved him. That's why he broke my heart. If you don't love somebody, they can't break your heart. The only time they can break your heart is if you love them. And so realizing that I love deeply, that means I have so much love inside of me. I loved this church deeply, this community that I used to be a part of. So much so that when that ended, I thought I was going to die. It had to be that cruel for me to be able to go back to the stories of my childhood. It had to remind me of what else was cruel. Oh yeah, I remember this, right? In my childhood. So putting all of these pieces together is what helped me understand I have so much love inside of me, and I am going to find a way to access this love, because this is like my own personal, it's like my own personal stash of God's love inside of me that does not depend on whether I find the church, a good pastor, or a good religious community, whatever it is, a good, partner. Like it doesn't depend on any of that. It's already inside of me. And it makes sense that if there is this divine being who created us, it makes sense to me that we would be created with love, and that we can find ways to access that love, and it doesn't depend on anybody else. That we can do that work ourselves with the help of this beautiful God, and in a good community where we're not going to depend on them. We're just going to walk together. I think that makes a difference.
Thank you for taking us through all of those pieces and how they can be valuable, even the painful ones, even the shameful ones.
Thank you.
It's rearranging those pieces so they fit the puzzle to bring out the beauty and the love and make you whole again.
Yeah.
Now, in the final chapter, which leads to a next chapter, is we will be having a webinar about church hurt with you. And that's been another significant part of your life, as you described, how it was part of what was kind of the final needle on the haystack that really crumbled for your life. So introduce how you went through church hurt and what you'll be sharing with us in the month ahead. And just for our listeners, many of them have also had their versions or experiences of church hurt, whether it's been explosive and painful to the degree of losing faith or disillusionment with scars that they still limp along, or it's suppressed, or spiritual abuse, or whatever various forms. But it's a topic that we've heard a lot about in my conversations during the past year with Catalyst Wellness Alliance. And so that's coming up. We'll announce the date on our Instagram and Facebook and erasingshame.com. But take a few minutes to describe what someone goes through with church hurt.
Yeah, and in my experience, and I'll just introduce it briefly, but church was a big part of my life because I grew up as an orphan, and so in church, there's a lot of talk about like church is your family, right? And so for someone like me who was literally an orphan and experienced so much harm with the people who should have loved me but couldn't for whatever reason, church was a refuge for me. So I came into church maybe right out of high school, and it just the idea that there was this being that was greater than me, who had planned me and who wanted me to be on this earth, was irresistible because it was targeting the scene of being in the womb and someone trying to kill me, my dad, because he doesn't want me. So I came to the church that way, and it became a safe place for me, and it became a refuge from my childhood. And I was a part of the church, all the way from, very young adult, right after high school, until about, 3 or 4 years ago. I love the church so much because I felt like, there's so many people who are hurting in the world who don't have families. Like, I really believed that the church could be that for people. And I believed it with all my heart. And I was in it 100,000%. But what happened with me is I depended on them to be that. And that's where I think that's where the issue comes in. It's like if we are depending on anything external, whether it's a partner, like a husband, wife, or an organization, we're humans, right? We're going to fail. There's going to be failure in that. There's going to be betrayal, possibly. And there's a very good chance that that's going to happen. And so as I was doing work in trauma in the church, and this particular church was not trauma informed, I was the trauma care director and the trauma care pastor, but I was the only one who knew about trauma. And so the large part of the leadership there did not know, it was not aware of how trauma worked. And of course, I was doing the efforts that I could, to be able to trauma inform this church. But it essentially became a failure of love, and a failure of love. And that happens a lot. And it happens in churches too, because there's humans, the leaders are human. And so for me, because I had depended on this religious community as a family, it was essentially their failure of love is what I actually needed. I actually needed that so that I could find my way back to, when was the first failure of love for you? If I had never gone through what I went through with the heartbreak of losing my church community, I would have not felt the need to go back to the first person who ever broke my heart, which was my father. So it all goes, it all just kind of ties together into, yes, there was a failure of love, very cool one, in the church community that I experienced. I'm still grieving that. I don't think it's anything that I'll ever forget. I felt like someone had died. That's how it was for me. Could never step back into church after that because it died. And inside of me, it's like, it died. It's dead. And something of me was also dead. And so part of my healing has been, what parts of me died and how can I engage that death? It's not about how do I get back into church. I mean, there's so many churches here in Atlanta, which I would have, people tell me, oh, well, I just go to another church, like it didn't work out at the other one, but like go to another one. And they'll hire you immediately, like, all these things. And I could never explain, like, it's not replaceable. For me, it's not replaceable because when there's a death, you cannot replace that. But for me, it was about, okay, what parts of me died? And I need to engage the death that happened, mourn it, grieve it, and then find ways to move on and heal and find goodness in a different kind of community.
So you've laid out for us a number of challenges. One is to recognize the disappointment and the parts that died, and then also recovering and finding beauty again. And you haven't lost your faith. You've recognized that. And as I'm hearing you talk, it's like, man, the church overpromises and underdelivers. And
exactly.
the church just overplays its hand in terms of what God delivers versus what the church imperfectly can present, but isn't so clear and honest about it oftentimes.
Right.
And that's very confusing. That's very confusing.
It is confusing. And in a lot of churches, there's so much power, and I think the power gets, all of that. So
that's where it gets really confusing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Power, relationships, enmeshment. I mean, there's so many layers to it.
Mhm.
And that's what you'll touch on in the webinar. And then after the webinar, there will be an exclusive invitation for you to join a healing group, story work through Church Heard with Sonia and her expertise.
Yes.
So
yes,
that's a coming attraction. Stay tuned at erasingshame.com in our socials, and we'll invite you to that webinar, hopefully within the coming month. Okay. Sonia, thank you so much for sharing this space with me and with our audiences on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, Facebook. We'll put it out there too.
Thank you so much, DJ, for having me. It was an honor to be here with you.
Thank you for fighting the good fight. Showing wellness for yourself and many others. You're so loved.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.